All right, thanks everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. So thanks for joining us this morning, and for those on the line, thanks for joining us on the line. I'm Shirley Bittlingmeyer. I'm the chair of PACSAW, which stands for President's Advisory Committee on the Status of Women. It's also on the banner. We work to seek opportunities for women at OP. And actually, there is a committee on every campus now. So every campus has the same kind of setup with the same structure, and then we meet twice a year at a system-wide level to talk about opportunities for women across the system. We currently have 34 members, and we will be doing a recruitment in the spring. So if you're interested in becoming a member, there's information that you can pick up. It's a little flyer outside, so you can pick this up, and then you can send a note to the PACSAW distribution list and let us know if you're interested. And then what we'll do is the information will be in link, but we'll also send you a special invitation to apply to become a member. We'd love to see you join. Today, just so you know, the Women We Admire speaker series actually started in 2009, so it's been going on for quite a while. PACSAW here at OP is 10 years old, so we are celebrating our 10-year anniversary this year. So yay for us! Yay! Yay! Today we have our guest speaker, Ann Kovalchick from UC Merced, and I'm going to turn the mic over to Tom Andriola, who is our UC Chief Information Officer for for UC. We will leave time for questions at the end, so if you can hold your questions until then, you can either send your questions through the chat feature, or you can also unmute your phone. For those that are on the phone, we'll allow you to unmute your phone at the end of the talk. All right, so right now I'm going to turn it over to Tom. Okay. Thanks, Tom.
And I'm just going to take a quick minute to introduce Ann. Ann, came to us from Drake University, and it was really great bringing her into the team. Again, we look at our IT community as a community across all the different campuses and medical centers, and we have 7,500 IT professionals working across the university. And one of the things that we have really strived for is to connect what we do to the mission. And when we brought Ann to Merced, one of the things that I saw in her candidacy and bringing her into that campus with all the dynamic changes that are going on was someone with her background, which I'll cover in a second, of someone who really is very mission focused, sitting in the Chief Information Officer chair. And, so I said Ann came from Drake University, but what you may not know about Ann is, in addition to, having a bachelor's from Ohio University, in addition to having a master's in public anthropology from American University, she is one of only 2 of our CIOs who has a PhD, right? And that is quite an accomplishment. Absolutely. And brings also a lot of value when we speak to the faculty about the mission, right? Because she has been very steeped in the academy as part of, her educational experiences and her professional experience. So we feel very blessed to have brought Ann into the UC family. Appreciate that you made the long drive from Merced here arduous drive to speak to our audience today, and we really look forward to your message today. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I am really quite honored to be asked to spend some time to talk with you. And what I want to do today is just highlight some of the formative experiences I've had that have brought me here, and interweave with that some of the ideas and concepts that I use to kind of do the work that I do. But I, again, appreciate being here, and I hope that I make good use of your time, that you've come and been willing to sit and listen to me for an hour. I'm going to start with a video. Whoops, that wasn't the video. Okay. Nope, that wasn't the video either. Let's see. Let's close that. Get back up here. Okay.
Moving early on meant throwing a few things into the back seat of my car. Then it meant packing
Oh, that's interesting.
their cars to help out. Then it became easier to just ship my stuff.
Okay. Thank you, Zoom. Well, we're going to skip that. Okay. What that video was about, and it's just as well, let me get back to the presentation here. There we go. Okay. So what that was really about was change. The change has very much defined my life. I've moved around quite a bit, as the video explains, sort of on average, a new state every 6.5 years. And so that has exposed me a lot of different things. And I think that what I want to talk about today is highlight how that change has impacted me. I like this set of images, though, because I think it also shows something else that I really believe in, which is that it's helpful to sometimes shift your perspective. We should remember that what was once women's work is now men's work, and that really does free us up to do a lot more. And so it's important to kind of keep that in mind as we think about our role professionally. This is an early picture of me showing off some of my cool technology with a couple of my girlfriends. I couldn't recall who that boy was, obviously a neighborhood boy, but I'm pretty sure he was explaining to me how to use the record player. I grew up in South Chicago, in the suburbs of South Chicago, had a remarkably ordinary childhood. My mother was a school teacher. My father sold refractories, which is the brick inside of a steel mill. And spent time, you know, the three of us going out to dinner. They would take me to Chicago to plays and movies. My parents grew up in Western Pennsylvania, so I was very East Coast oriented. But again, a very kind of average home life. And then in this picture, I'm about the 6th grade, I think, and kind of one of my first big feminist acts was to lead a petition to be able to wear pants in the harsh, cold Chicago winters. Probably driven by the fact that when I was 9, my brother was born, my brother Bob. Kind of the first time I was pushed aside by a man. Always resented it the rest of my life that he never had to clean the kitchen in spite of the fact that my mother was a very modern woman and had gone after a master's degree and so forth. I then went to Ohio University, which, by the way, has Rufus the bobcat as its mascot, similar, same as UC Merced. And at that time, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. I was one of those kids that had never really, you know, had a particular thing I wanted to be and really didn't understand the significance of that decision. And I ended up what's called a radio TV major or a broadcast major, which was the big major at that time. So these are pictures of some of the first machines I worked with, video switchers and TV switchers and master control. I had looked in the archives and I saw this article on the left heralding the coming age of computing. Now, this is 1982 when, you know, computing was going to change teaching and learning and research, and still we wait. But notably, I was not very aware of computers at that time. I was much more geared to mass media. So one summer, I wrangled a internship with Radio Free Europe. And this felt like really expansive work. It seemed really relevant. My work was to queue up the tapes to play back at the top of the news hour. But this seemed, as I said, really relevant work. This is the early 80s. There was a lot of money being put into anti-Soviet efforts. And though it seemed relevant and expansive and exciting, it also felt to me a little icky. It felt a little vaguely clandestine because the objective of Radio Free Europe is to bias the listeners. And I wasn't sure how I felt about it. It was very ideological. It was also very male-dominated. And then in the summer, a friend of mine in college had suggested that I go to Europe. I was feeling I wanted to explore things a bit. And he said, well, just save up some money and go. And I thought, okay, I'll do that. So I did that. I worked 2 summers, 2 jobs one summer and then over break, and saved my money. And my parents they thought this was a very charming idea, but somewhat far-fetched, and eventually almost forbid me to go, and relented when they realized I was going anyway. But the reason was because I had decided to go alone. I didn't want that trip to be dependent on someone going with me that might back out and then endanger the trip. And that was why my parents had been so alarmed. And in hindsight, I see that now as kind of an indication of my independence of thought, but also my sort of distrust of relying on others, and that has a good aspect and a bad aspect. The other significant thing, though, was that this was one of the first times I had had a goal out there and had worked to achieve it and sort of reach that goal. So that kind of gave me an appreciation for planning, and I had done so sort of in defiance of my parents' authority. So I then, a group of Nigerians had come to the university, and I trained them on radio TV, and my advisor, who wanted to start an international broadcasting curriculum, said, why don't you go do an internship in Nigeria? And I thought, okay, well, that sounds really cool. So I went there, spent about 5 months there working in a Plateau State TV. It was the first color television station launched in sub-Saharan Africa, and covered the legislature and President Shagari. So, you know, this was an amazing experience, of course. I mean, I was really exposed to a lot of new things and able to go places that you really can't go to now. It also really helped me understand the value of being an outsider, because I was very much an outsider. And I found that to be an interesting perspective, and one that I could really appreciate and make use of. So Victor Turner is an anthropologist who writes a lot about liminality, and liminality is kind of that space in between states of being. It's usually a very unstructured space. It's a space of ritual where social conventions often break down and social relationships can be variable. And so think of us, for example, a graduation is very much a liminal experience where you're hooded by your advisor, or maybe you're on the same platform as the president and the provost and the chancellor. So that's what I mean about how the social conventions switch up a bit. And I had begun to find from my travels that this was a comfortable feeling for me to be in this unstructured space. Probably wondering why there's a crock pot. Well, the reason there's a crock pot is after I'd done some traveling, I came home briefly and then went to Nigeria. Like over the Christmas holidays, I was at home and a bunch of high school friends came over and they gave me a going away gift, and they gave me a crock pot, which is not that useful if you're going to Nigeria. Big, doesn't travel well, electricity's kind of dicey over there. But it symbolized how for my friends, they were moving into kind of conventional trajectories of settling in their first house, domestic bliss, getting their appliances. And I was not. I was in a completely different space, which also created a kind of alienation in being in that unstructured liminal environment that, again, I have come to find is very natural for me. So I then next joined the Peace Corps. I had known a graduate student in college who had asked me to help him with a research project. So I'd gone to Belize for about 4 weeks, and then after I graduated, he had suggested I contact the Minister of Education because they needed someone to initiate educational TV. So I wrote a letter, like today you would reach out on LinkedIn. I actually got a typewriter and typed up a letter. And they wrote back and they said they were very interested, but they couldn't afford me when I joined the Peace Corps. And I thought, okay, why not? So again, here in the early 80s, when, it was time of supply side economics, kind of attempts to eliminate the welfare state, or the first set of attempts at least. And here I was off on a public service journey. So again, sort of doing something that was very contrary to the norm and to my cohort at that time. But I went down there, spent lovely time, worked to build out an educational TV unit and public broadcasting unit in the city TV station. Did a lot of training on video, and then I next went to Tegucigalpa, Honduras with Project Hope. Project Hope provides medical services and medical training in underserved, underdeveloped rural areas. So I went down there to build out a medical video unit. And it was here that I began to feel, again, a little uncomfortable and uncertain, because I began to realize both in Nigeria, Belize, and now in Honduras, that there was a tendency to ascribe to the media this authority and power that I wasn't quite sure it deserved. We would go into these very rural villages and it would be sort of high noon, and we'd have this little 15-inch black and white TV run on a large battery system. And people would rush to it and watch, even though you couldn't really see much, videos about washing your hand and brushing your teeth, or kids would mug in front of the video camera. We'd walk through crowds and people would part. So it was very odd to see this sense of importance and authority and power attributed just by having this media equipment and being a media person. Although people in the industry locally gained a lot of social and political capital as they trained to be media producers and so forth. But as I said, I began to grow very uncomfortable because I really didn't see that we were having that much impact, certainly not structurally, and certainly not in Honduras at that time. The Contra War was going on, and I wondered if the medical services that I was trying to support were in part being driven by the war that the government was supporting. And, you know, I began to look around and think, what is the work I want to do and what really matters to me? I eventually came back to the States. So I need to move this little thing here. Whoops. Okay. Well, I don't even see where my, oh, here we go. Sorry for this pause here, but, well, you'll have to trust there's a quote under there. Oh, it's gonna drive me crazy. I don't know where my mouse is. Why can't I see it? In any case, so anyway, I want to say here, I'm going to say something that may seem somewhat tragic, but I think is important because it's an example of how sometimes life requires you to really think about how you're going to live your most authentic life and sort of gives you the conditions in which to find that out. And that is that in my family, my father was an alcoholic. And those of you who have dealt with addiction understand the dynamic that places in a family. So I spent many years after I came back from Honduras really trying to discover what that meant and how that made me feel and what was that impact that it had on me. And I found that oddly, it really gave me a number of strengths. You know, my father was a very high-functioning alcoholic, and my mother was very much an enabler. But again, this was the 60s and 70s. There was a lot of stigma on divorce and alcoholism. We didn't know that much about addiction and have the structural environment to really address that. But again, I found that it really gave me a number of strengths. One of those is systems thinking. I really learned to think in terms of the system. My family was a system, and I went in and I had to always kind of figure out what are the patterns here, what's going on. David Snowden is a management consultant who writes about the Cunafin network framework, which is a really interesting framework that kind of identifies systems in terms of those that are ordered, predictable, repeatable, and those that are less so. And the different sets of skills you need to kind of understand what's going on at a system level in those environments. And I really feel like had I not been forced at a young age to really consider the system, my family, the things that were going on, I would not have been able to really develop the skills that I used subsequently through my travels and other challenges to really look at the system and understand, is it a predictable one, is it not? What are the behaviors? How are people, what are they saying about this system versus how they're really acting? So this was a very important insight for me to have gained. A second is sense-making. Carl Weick is an organizational theorist, and he wrote a very good article about the Man Gulch fire, which is a fire in the late 40s in which 16 smoke jumpers were surrounded by a fire unexpectedly. All but 3 died, and the foreman of the smoke jumpers, what he did when they were surrounded by this fire is he burnt an area in front and told the men to lay down there because then the fire would burn over them. And he told them to drop their tools and lay down, and they didn't listen to him. They subsequently were consumed by the fire. And he tells the story as an example that sense-making is more than retrospectively rationalizing. You have to really look at the context. You have to make sense in the context. It's rationalized contextual thinking that is really sense-making. And I have found this to be very much a skill that I have and use often as I think systematically. It's also why I decided to go into anthropology. I found that the focus on understanding context was something I really appreciated and learned the tools and methods as I studied anthropology. So I went to American University, studied public anthropology, applied anthropology, it was called at that time. And I also wanted to explore more further this phenomena that I had seen in Nigeria, Honduras, and Belize, in which the media and the technology was sort of empowered. And I did a master's thesis on cable public access TV, on the cable access station in Washington, D.C. And I found that there were two groups of people that used cable access TV. Those who wanted to develop a political voice, and those who wanted a shortcut to a broadcast journalism degree rather than go to a four-year college. So two very different groups created a lot of friction. While I was going to school, I was also working as the director of a media center in the School of Communication at Ohio University. And at that time, I was playing with HTML and online discussion forums and things like that. Became aware of digital technologies and the web, and decided to go after a PhD. And I decided to go into education because I felt that my undergraduate work had made me think about media and technology as a kind of social communication, mass communication tool. I had studied it culturally in anthropology, and so I also wanted to understand kind of cognitively, how do people learn and how do they understand and design messages? So I went to University of Virginia, got a PhD, but I think what really, this period of education was really important to me because it taught me how to ask questions, the importance of asking questions and getting the question right. I had a lot of help along the way. Pat Ofter-Heidi was a thesis advisor in my master's program. She taught me that good intellectual work is really about focus. She also taught me an instrumentalist philosophy. Don't blame the tool. Instead, figure out if you have the right tool and are you using it correctly. And then Polly McClure was the CIO at University of Virginia, and I worked in her office. My thesis or my dissertation was a grounded theory study of a technology implementation. And she was the one who really, made me consider doing a CIO position because it seemed to be an opportunity for me to use all of my skills. I had to look at the institution system from a systems perspective. I had to do a lot of sense making around technologies in context for different uses. And then because technology is always changing, there was a very liminal space. Things are always sort of in flux. And by the way, the education environment is a very liminal space because there's a lot of identity change that goes on in education. Students come in, with a particular self-identity and they leave with another. So it's a very unstable environment. So after that, I went to Ohio University, which at Ohio University, I directed an academic technology center. I actually built it up from 2 people to 6. Did a lot of things like built educational CD-ROMs and web pages and so forth. Implemented Course Info, which was an early LMS system. But here again, I began to notice, so this is, the late 90s, that there was a lot of attention to digital technologies, a lot of that, attention to tools for innovation and so forth. And yet people were reacting very emotionally to these technologies as well, similar to what I observed in Honduras and Nigeria. So again, I sort of began to explore why is it that people have this great hope and sense of redemption around technology. I then went to Tulane University. I started there in May of 2005, and 3 months later, Hurricane Katrina hit. And that was a very devastating, very sort of epic experience. I had meetings with people on a Friday, and they died 2 days later, washed away. And I found that I also, because I had started in May, over that summer period, the university tends to slow down. And so I didn't really wasn't well integrated into the leadership. I didn't know my staff that well. And it ended up that over the fall, I had to continue to manage the staff and work with the leadership, and we were spread across the country. So we didn't even have the benefit of being near each other. And the people were under tremendous stress because their personal lives had been devastated as well as their professional lives. The university was closed. There was a lot of rebuilding. Fortunately, my home was not flooded, and I thought about leaving, and yet I'm one of those people that, if you drive down the highway and you miss the exit, you got to go to the next one and circle your way back. You can't go to the shoulder and sneak back, not allowed. So I decided to stay and see how it would go. The CIO that hired me eventually left shortly after the storm, and they had an interim in there. And he asked me very explicitly to stay. He said, we need someone who's an outsider. Because New Orleans is a a lot of family, a lot of history there. People who live there have lived there, have generations of family. And Tulane was a very small, close-knit university, and he really wanted someone who could kind of challenge perspectives at that time. And so, indeed, I stayed. And then we had Charlie McMahon was their next CIO, who was very much a mentor to me, taught me a lot about research computing. But I didn't think Charlie was making the right decisions. So I thought, maybe I should just go be a CIO so I can make the decisions. So I did that. I went on to Drake University and, of course, UC Merced, both institutions that required, again, someone coming in to kind of build capacity, make sense of things at a time of great change. So as I wrap up, I want to highlight here that, like many women, I've had sort of the usual catalog of examples of slights and hostilities and such from male colleagues. I've been told I should smile more often, or that I'm too demanding, or I should wear more eye makeup so that my eyes are brighter. I'm too emotional, or too bitchy, or I say X, and then the guy say X, and then like, oh wow, he said X, and it's really great. Feeling invisible. I've seen men, who cannot manage power be given more power that they can't manage and therefore waste. I've been expected as a female to be the one who remembers the birthdays and the celebrations and so forth. So, these are real things that happen to us, and they're patterns that we know exist in the world, and we've been objects, and we felt as objects that we've been mistreated or misunderstood, and these are real things, and they have consequences, and we're right to call them out. But Mary Douglas is an anthropologist she wrote a book called Purity and Danger, an analysis of pollution and taboo, and she writes about how you can understand a lot about societies when you look at how they categorize things, and what a society considers impure. And the example is dirt. Dirt is just matter out of place. If you see dirt on the side of a road, you don't think much of it, but you see it in your kitchen, and it's not supposed to be there. So we have very strong ways of kind of categorizing things. And I've thought about this a lot, both on a macro level, as I've gone into organizations and helped them change, that when you start moving things around, again, there are very real impacts, and it's very destabilizing, and it's important to attend to the consequences that you create when you move things around. But I've also thought about this in terms of my interactions with men, and I don't so much feel like a woman in a male-dominated field so much as a woman in a male-dominated society. And so when I encounter a male who, thinks that I should be less emotional, or thinks that I should wear more eye makeup, what that says to me is I'm just not in that man's prescribed category. And then I just sort of feel bad for him because he's just got, maybe too narrow categories, and I think it's important to keep that in mind. It's how others view you, and they may not have the categories that aptly represent how you see yourself. Elizabeth Colson is an anthropologist. She was actually at UC Berkeley for much of her career. And in 1995, she did the Malinowski Award, and she talks about uncomfortable knowledge, something that anthropologists often feel when you go in and you kind of observe a social system and you begin to see the discontinuities between what people say and how they behave and so forth. And that uncomfortable knowledge is something that, challenges orthodoxy. And I think it's important to always explore your uncomfortable knowledge. I think it's something we hold a lot about men, because we all have, you know, fathers and brothers and sons and uncles and so forth. So we know men are good. But it's important, I think, to kind of examine that uncomfortable knowledge in all aspects of your life. I think it's really important. It helps drive a lot of change and prepare you for uncertain futures. Rafael Ramirez is a scenario planner at Oxford School of Scenario Planning, and he talks about feral futures. He actually mentions 3 types of futures. The first is tame futures, and those are futures that we can predict based on past data and probabilities. You know, traffic patterns, for example. We can collect data, we can pretty effectively estimate traffic patterns based on past data. Then there's wild futures, and those things that we know we don't know, but we see happening, the emergence of social media, for example, or the impact of, you know, Google, Facebook, media companies, and so forth. And then there's feral futures, and feral futures are those futures that look a little bit to us like wild futures, but we think that we can treat them like tame futures. The example he gives is the 3 Mile Island nuclear reactor meltdown, where the technicians pulled out their instructions for managing a nuclear reactor failure, and those actually made things worse because they had not accounted for what was actually happening. Another example is the credit default debacle in 2008, where, you know, we think we know what's going on, and then we think we know what we should do. We actually don't know that we don't know what's going on. And the way to anticipate those feral futures is, I think, to really explore your uncomfortable knowledge and think about, maybe, as White said, you have to drop your tools. You have to do the thing that seems counterintuitive. You have to really push back and ask the questions. And I think by doing that, you can unlock a lot of your power. For me, it was seeing systems and patterns. It was living in these liminal spaces and learning to be a sense maker, learning to ask questions, thinking about multiple perspectives, and really kind of finding and exploring the uncomfortable knowledge that I was picking up. There's downsides to this. You know, one of the things I've realized is I tend not to ask for help. And sometimes I should be asking for help. Being an outsider can be alienating, and sometimes people just don't like me because I ask the wrong questions. But I think, again, in doing that, that you really are able to kind of find yourself and ultimately recognize that things do change. You know, in this picture on the left there, that's a 5 megabyte hard drive, you know. I mean, on the right are, you know, several of my staff you may not be able to see, but there's 2 women and they have a lot more than 5 megabytes in their hand. So things do change, and I think it's important then to keep that in mind, think about the impact you want to have, and really think about what is your personal power and how do you cultivate it. So with that, I am happy to take any questions. I can go back real quick if we want to look at the quotes. They're really good.
As a anthropologist as well, I say this, and it never would have occurred to me. Mind you, I studied archaeology, so systems would be.
Yeah, you're the bones people. The bones, stones and bones.
Exactly. I'm just absolutely incredulous with how taking everything you studied in anthropology and going to systems. Where was the connection in your heart that just made you say, again, the CIO, when you worked there, but where did the big aha moment come?
You know, I don't know that there was an aha moment. You know, it really was just like a series of uh-oh moments. But it really was driven by this desire to explore why things were at that time, whatever situation or context, but why is it like that? Because, you know, I mean, a current example I'll give you now is, you know, we all can think of how we see technologies as, you know, having these, again, these very redemptive properties that they're going to fix everything and solve everything. And they don't. And so I'm sort of curious as to why we ascribe this incredible power. And they're important tools and they have very positive impacts. But, you know, what captures me is the kind of discrepancy between what we imagine and the actual hard work that it takes to get that value out of technology.
If you like someone who's kind of dive headfirst into change and get really excited about it, what kind of helped you develop that personality trait, or what?
Well, because it's about figuring out problems, you know, and maybe, you know, when I travel, what I like about traveling is the challenge of figuring out what to us are everyday issues, but in a new environment become really interesting problems. You know, the way people park varies. You know, I mean, I can remember in Des Moines, they park, there's a lot of like perpendicular, diagonal parking. And I thought, oh, it's just so weird, you know, and I don't know why it's like that, but, you know, I had to learn to kind of, and they would back in, because there'd be signs, you can't go in head first, you have to back in. So, you know, I was fascinated in new places how things that are very ordinary, everyday operational aspects of getting through the day can vary tremendously. So that's a change, and figuring that out is, to me, just a very intellectually engaging effort.
What can you see as elements that might encourage and have girls go more into STEM? What do you see from an anthropological point of view, for instance, would make a change so that would happen?
I think you go into it like you're going into another country. You know, because you know you're probably going to be your opportunities come to you differently because you're a female, or you may be the only or one of a few female, and so the norms are not necessarily aligned to, your gender perspective. So I think the only way to cope with it is go in, you know, and see it as not your culture. And so what is it about it that, you know, you have to then be fascinated by it in order to kind of maneuver and find your way. Yeah, you had a question?
Yeah, I just want to know, after all of that, what made you land at Merced?
Well, you know, I mean, this idea of building a new university, I was like, I gotta see that. You know, how do you do that? And it's pretty audacious. And I will say, I was telling Diane this before folks came in, what I did not account for was the colossalness of the UC system. I mean, I knew Merced was part of a state system, but I just, you know, didn't really grasp that. And so that has been very fascinating, and, you know, even makes that endeavor even more complex and challenging. Yeah.
So I want to challenge the STEM question, and that is, you didn't go to STEM.
No, I didn't.
And so how do we take that model and actually flip it? So rather than making it all about STEM, making it,
oh, yeah,
how do you
right.
engage in sort of
Well, I mean, I think
background and open those eyes and minds of both genders, frankly, into seeing how it doesn't have to be this way, that if you take a more broader approach, you might find the answers to broader questions. Right. In a more diverse way.
Well, I mean, I would say that I think that STEM curricula ought to include humanities and social science. So the change that has to happen there is at the academic leadership issue. But of course, by the time individuals get in those positions, they are well enculturated. So, you know, I think that on some level, like all change, it's sort of on a person-to-person basis. And, you know, it sort of depends on who's going into what STEM program for what purpose. But in general, I would like to see more emphasis placed on being a little bit more thoughtful around the complexities of the world, because I think that's sort of the problem we have now in the world. You can be a really great, data scientist or, quantitative, whatever, but being able to sort of understand the nuances and interpret the meaning of the data in practice, in context, I think comes from not only exposure to humanities and social science curriculum, but also exposure to unfamiliar environments that you have to kind of work yourself through.
So speaking of environment,
Yes.
you now have the IT Leadership Council thing with CIOs
Right.
system-wide, and I believe there's 3 women.
Yes.
Can you describe some of the dynamics that may occur there, and, do you feel that it's sort of an equitable, environment?
Oh, yeah, I think it's equitable. I think the dynamics there are largely driven less by gender and more by the personalities of individual schools. So what I see there played out, and I say this probably very much as, again, an outsider to California, to the UC system, but I see very much a social dynamic that's driven by local campus personality, history, and role, more so than gender.
In other words, I'm UCLA, they're private.
Yeah, but part of the reason is, I think, part of the reason though, and this is really important, and this is, because technology is so expensive, and scale is a critical variable when making a technology decisions. Those schools are so large, and Merced is sort of like a rounding error. And so this is like, personally, I don't have a lot at stake in a lot of those conversations. And I'm more than happy to go along with some of those decisions because that's not my biggest pain point, probably a bigger pain point for them.
You're in the CL position like public schools and public sector. So what's the difference to be like a CL, say, in the private sector? Is the challenge or the things that are very different, or is it kind of relevant?
I think in the private sector you can enforce more standardization, which is like enormously important to building out efficiency. You also are able to measure a little bit more directly cost and value. And you typically have, one constituency to respond to, which is the leadership of the business units. I think in higher ed, in higher ed you've got, a value on openness.